red ball of the sun dropped behind the summit of the great bald mountain. In the doorway of the ancient log cabin, by the side of the stony road that wound upward towards the gap, sat Granny Tollitt. In the room behind her was her granddaughter of about 18 years, and she was humming a ballad as she washed the supper dishes. "Them clouds forebodes falling weather, Dilsey," mumbled the grandmother, as a gust rattled the dry bean pods that swung from the porch rafters. "Yes, Granny," replied the girl, coming to the door. "I've been listening to the wind roaring like big waters." After Dilsey finished washing the dishes, she drew a chair next to her grandmother, and the two sat for some time in silence, gazing out across the mountain ridges towards the fiery sunset. Truth be told, though, it wasn't the glory of the dying day, nor the beauty of the tinted ridge tops that had drawn Granny Tollitt to her usual seat on the porch of that ancestral cabin. This evening, just like every other summer day, her gaze roamed no farther than the grassy meadow across the road. Silhouetted against the flaming western skyline stood a crudely carved slab of brownish stone with a tiny picket fence enclosure. The fence was a dingy yellow and interlaced with wild honeysuckle. The slab marked the head of a vine-tangled grave, and it was no longer upright and tilted at an angle. "I'm afraid your pa's rock's gonna blow clear down on the next big wind, honey," said the old woman. "I've been planning for a while for me and you to get out there and fix it up. I'll help you whenever you say, but Granny, I wish we could sell a calf or something and put up a store-bought stone in place of that homemade one," replied the girl. "Look at here, Missy," retorted her grandmother tartly. "Whatever put such a crazy idea in your head? Didn't I take the horse and sled that rock down from the quarry? Didn't I fashion it with your granddad's cold chisel and carve the writing on it with my own hand? Sure, Granny, I know that, but it gives me the creeps to sit here every night and to look at them words on it. What's the matter with them words, gal? Ain't they the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Here lays Tom Tollitt on the spot where he was murdered by the devil, John Cutshaw. Ain't that the God's truth? Yes, Granny, it's the truth. I know, but what's the good of putting it where we've got to look at it for every day of our life? Paul's dead and gone, and John Cutshaw, he's been in the pen for 5 years now. Child, I want you to think about it all of your days. You're the only child my son ever had, and your mama died the night you was born, and he shot your daddy down right there in that meadow. I took you in and I raised you, and I put up that monument stone, and I graved it that way so you could never forget." The girl made no reply. The years of stern tutelage in the lonely cabin had taught her the submission that is the highest virtue of childhood in the mountains. Granny turned to her granddaughter. "Honey, go fetch the lantern and let's brighten up while we're sitting. There's a big revival starting tomorrow night at the church." "Well, I'm glad there'll be something to do," replied Dilsey with a glimmer of interest. "It won't be so lonesome like." Suddenly, Dilsey stepped to the edge of the porch and she leaned against the rustic handrail. "Listen, Granny, there's somebody riding up this way. I hear horses' hooves on the rocks." "Oh, it's probably some feller over there on Turkey Tail going through the gap, I reckon," surmised her granny. And within a few minutes, a horseman came into view and he tied his horse at the gate. "Why, it's Mosley Riddle," Dilsey whispered as her young eyes recognized the rider. "Howdy, folks," came a neighborly greeting out of the dusk. "Tolerable," said Granny. "How's yourself? Lighten up and come on in." "No, ma'am. Much obliged. I just rode by to ask if you heard the news." "What news?" both women asked at once. "John Cutshaw's out." "Oh, goodness, no, Mosey. You know he ain't," shouted Granny, and the lantern fell from her hands to the floor. "Yes, Miss Tollitt, I got it straight from Lawyer Benson down in town this morning. But Mosey, he was set up for life, and he ain't been there but 5 years next month." "Well, anyhow, he's out," repeated Mosey. "The governor signed his pardon on Tuesday, and they say he's headed for home. I know you uns wouldn't like to hear it, but I thought you ought to know. Well, I'll be plugging along. It looks like it's going to storm some." Stunned by the news, the women sat without speaking a word for some time. Granny finally broke the silence. "Dilsey, there'll be trouble in Thundering Creek account of this. I can't figure it out, though. How would any governor turn loose a man like that? John Cutshaw's got rich kin out in flat country, Granny. There ain't hardly nothing folks can't do if they've got money, replied the girl. Listen, Dilsey, with a ring of decision in her voice. Run and get the old hunting horn, the one your grandpa used to bear hunt with. Dilsey returned in a moment with a great brass ox horn of remarkable length and size. Granny said, Here, take it, honey. You're big and stout in your chest. Blow 4 long toots like you were calling for the bear dogs. Then wait a minute and blow 4 more. Do it 3 times that way. The young girl obeyed, and she put all her strength into deep-throated blast that shrilled through the valley in the dusk, above the noise of the wind in the pines. The echoes floated back, wave on wave. That'll fetch 'em, declared Granny as the reverberations died down. The boys will be coming in a hurry, hearing their paw's old hunting horn. It ain't been blowed since the day John Cutshaw killed your paw. The twilight faded swiftly into darkness on a moonless night. An hour after the great horn had sounded, a hound dog that laid at Granny's feet arose and sent up a long howl that silenced the whippoorwills. The sounds of horses echoed like thunder. And within a few minutes, 4 horsemen were dismounting at the gate, amid the nickering of horses and the yapping of hounds. These 4 horsemen owned much of Thundering Creek Valley, but they dominated all of it. Each ruled his household with a hand of iron, according to the code of the mountains. But each one knew to mind his maw as implicitly in manhood as he had done when he was a small boy. Here we are, maw. What's happened? Called the eldest son, John, as he looped his bridle rein over the gatepost. Plenty's happened, replied his mother, as all 4 sons filed into the cabin. I don't like to tell you, but you've got to know. The governor's pardoned John Cutshaw, and he's coming back here tomorrow, like it or not. A low growl of rage rumbled in the shadowy room, like the first distant tones of thunder. I knowed there was trouble when I heard Paul's old horn, but I never expected anything like this. I've got just one thing to say, remarked the quietest son, Rudy. If the law can't keep him out of this cove, I got something that can, with his right hand resting on a huge pistol strapped to his side. Rudy, now you're talking, exclaimed Jim Red, the youngest of the 4 men. If we'd had the spirit and the spunk that we ought to, John Cutshaw would already be put where no governor on earth could turn him out. I told you when all this happened that letting rattlesnakes and Cutshaws live was bad business. It's the living gospel, echoed Coy. We was looking to the law and the government for justice, and they've done us like dirt. If Ewins will stand by me, we'll put that scoundrel in a hole a lot tighter and a darker place than them state convict mines before tomorrow night. I'll stand by you till the end, vowed Jim Red. If the court can't give us no satisfaction for Tom's killing, his blood brothers will get satisfaction. Hear you, boys. Their mother's thin voice rang out sharply. Shut up, every one of you. You're barking and snapping like a passel of wolves. Now, Ma, protested Red Jim hotly, you shut us down from doing anything 5 years ago. We can't just sit still and let that scoundrel strut up and down this holler like he owned it. You know that Cutshaw tribe. They ain't good for nothing. Now, Ewins, quit your jawing and listen. The mother's eyes flashed, and her words cracked like a whip. Don't none of you feel worse towards them Cutshaws than I do. I've prayed to God to let me see that man lying cold and dead with a bullet through his heart. But I know, and you know, it ain't right, and you ain't gonna do no killing. But Ma, yelled out John, that's what you said before, and look where it got us. Thundering Creek ain't no safe place for nobody with him running loose. Now, don't give your ma none of that back talk, John. I know as well as you that ridding this cold of that reptile would make everybody on Thundering Creek draw their breath a lot easier. But you boys ain't gonna do it. None of our family has blood on their hands, and you ain't gonna stain them now. The discussion was ended, for now at least. The desperate rage of the brothers had spent itself, since the men would obey their mother's wishes. And as the men mounted their horses to depart, their ma shouted, the thing for all you to do is to tend to your own business and keep from crossing that man's path all you can. Me and Dilsey's aim to go to the revival meeting tomorrow night, and I'd be proud if Ewins would come. I'd like to see all of you profess to the Lord before I'm called home.
I've been on this gospel way for many, many days. But I know it won't be long till I am gone.
The next day, Reverend Thomas, a giant of a man with a voice like thunder, sat on a wooden chair behind a rudely crafted pulpit in a small mountain Baptist church. He was thumbing through the pages back and forth, deep in the throes of thought, looking for a text to speak to him. The mountain preacher looked up at the door, and in walked Granny Tollett and Dilsey through the front door of the church. The two women took their usual seats, and behind them, with a certain awkwardness, 4 men in heavy boots entered noisily. The congregation looked around with a mild surprise. You see, the Tollett boys hadn't darkened the church door since anybody could remember. Outside the church, the air was heavy, and storm clouds lingered on the horizon. Granny Collett's fall and weather prediction was true. Occasional lightning flashes filled the dim-lit church with dazzling whiteness, after which the tiny oil lamps in their wall brackets glowed a sickly yellow again. By now, the news of the sudden release of John Cutshaw had spread far and wide throughout Thundering Creek Valley. Reverend Thomas surmised that the release of Cutshaw and the unusual presence of Granny Tollett's sons in church were surely connected. Once the singing choir had scattered to their seats, the Reverend stood behind the pulpit and he launched into his hastily prepared sermon. "Vengeance is mine," he shouted in a booming voice. "I will repay, saith the Lord. These folks in this house tonight that's got good reasons for craving vengeance. That's human nature, and there's a heap of it in us mountain folks." Not one of the Tollett boys so much as blinked an eye. The preacher continued. "This is the good book talking tonight, talking a lot louder than that wind a-roaring out yonder, and that thunder a-popping. Now, Granny Tollett, you've had more to bear than most anybody. You've heard the blood of your firstborn calling from the ground, and God Almighty knows how loud it calls. But these here words were meant for you and your boys. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." Suddenly, something cracked in the distance. It was too short and sharp for thunder, and mountain men have a keen ear for sounds like that. It came again, nearer and nearer. There was no mistake about it. Any man in the room could tell you what that sound was, even the caliber of the pistol that made it. Then again, 6 shots rang out, followed by the clatter of hooves on stones. Coming around the bend of the road dashed a dozen hard-ridden horses, pounding through the darkness. Just the instant they passed in front of the church, lightning flashed and illuminated the men's faces. There he was, leading the pack of men, Calico Dick, known everywhere through Thundering Creek as the father of John Cutshaw. The entire Cutshaw clan was roaring past the church with the newly released John Cutshaw. Protected in the center of their posse, all of the Tollett boys pulled their pistols and headed for the door to confront him. When Granny Tollett's voice rang out, "Boys, if you ain't got no respect for the preacher or no fear for the Lord, surely you gotta mind your maw, and I say sit down." Sulkily, the big men faced about and took their seats. The next day, the rumor of the Cutshaws riding through Thundering Creek spread through the valley on swift wings. At Beckley's corn mill, it was the talk of the day. "It's a plumb outrage," shouted one man. "Them Tollett boys have taken too much. They kept their hands off and they let the law handle John, when a lot of folks would have saved the state the cost of trying that feller and then feeding him and clothing him. But after last night, nobody could blame them boys for killing him." Suddenly one man spoke up. "I heard John Cutshaw was sick, powerful sick, and that's why the governor pardoned him. They say all that work in them prison mines gave him the sickness." The owner of the mill spoke up. "All pooh. That's just a Cutshaw lie. The way they came tearing through here last night, no, that don't fit with a tale like that. I'm just telling you what I was told. They said once John got home last night, they put him in the bed, and they say he won't ever get out of that bed either." Before the day was over, word had spread all over. John Cutshaw had been sent home from the state convict mines to die in his native mountains. Granny Tollett was sitting in her chair on a porch when she heard the news. She gazed out towards her son's tombstone, and she said, "It don't seem hardly right for him to die all peaceful in a bed. But at least it won't be so hard to hold my boys back now, because I've been scared they're going to kill him. The revival continued at the church for the next 2 weeks, but Grandma Tollett hadn't went back. And one day, the preacher showed up at her cabin to talk the conditions over. Now, Granny's stubbornness was famous and well known throughout the mountains, and when the preacher arrived, he found her sitting in her chair on the porch with her Bible in her hand. "Sister Tollett," he began, "if everybody was pondering the book the way you're doing, there'd be souls born every night." Granny replied, "You can just take a seat. I assure you, there ain't gonna be no outpouring during our meeting, as long as there's an unpunished murderer running loose within a mile of your church, and there ain't gonna be no work of grace happening anytime soon." "Miss Tollett," the preacher interrupted, "I can't blame you for having hard feelings against John Cutshaw, but I'm gonna tell you something you ought to know. I'm feeling called to tell you." "Oh, you say your say," she responded. She closed her Bible and she pushed her spectacles back on her white temples. "I've been to see John. His mother sent for me this morning. When I got there, he was laying on his bed. Oh, I wouldn't have known him. He ain't more than a shadow of himself. His face was white as the pillar case, except for where the coal dust remains underneath his skin. He's in deep trouble. He admitted that he's been a terrible and wicked man, and that in his time he ought to have been hung. Why didn't he tell you something we don't already know?" Granny replied, "Well, I seen he was under powerful conviction, and it was hard on him. I asked him why he couldn't just go on and let go and pass on to the other side, when finally he told me what was holding him back." The preacher paused. "Well, go on, I'm hearing you," Granny replied. "He said they told him what was written on your son Tom's stone that you made, and them words keep arising between him and his maker. Ain't them words true?" Granny shouted. "Oh, no, I ain't saying they ain't, sister. I'm only telling you that they're rising up like a cloud in the face of a man that's trying to crawl back from the door of hell. Well, there ain't nothing I can do about it. He killed my boy, and I engraving that rock just like it was. What I've wrote is what I wrote, and that's in the good book too." "Miss Tollett," the pastor softened his voice, "I didn't come here to argue with you. You're a good woman, and you bore a heap in your time. You kept your boys from violence, and you saved John Cutshaw's body from being full of bullet holes. I'm asking you, would you do anything to save his soul?" Granny leaned forward in her chair, and she gripped her old Bible tightly in her hands. "No, I won't. That's asking too much, preacher. I'm willing to let him die in his bed, but he'll have to take what's coming to him after that and do his own dickering with God Almighty." With fire in her eyes, she watched as the preacher disappeared around the bend of the road. A few moments later, Dilsey returned from the orchard with an apron full of apples. "I'm needing you, Dilsey. Fetch that bucket of whitewash and a brush. We've fooled along long enough about fixing up your papa's grave. Let's go and do it right now." Underneath the sultry afternoon sun, the mountain girl and her grandmother dug and shoveled the stony clay around the base of the leaning stone. A little while later, when the women were through with their task, and at last the tombstone stood once again erect, it was flaunting its damning legend in the faces of passers-by. "Granny, you need to sit down and rest," said Dilsey. "Quit pestering me. I ain't ailing," she snapped. But she wouldn't sit down, and she roamed through the 3 rooms of the cabin restlessly. She grabbed a bucket of beans and she headed for the porch, and she began stringing the pods for drying. But suddenly, she rose from her chair as if she was startled. She scattered the beans everywhere. She went and she grabbed a hoe and she started climbing the steep path towards the corn patch above the orchard. "Granny, you'll get a sunstroke," cried Dilsey. "Leave me alone, I tell you. I'm needing a stir." For 2 hours, she swung that hoe like she was killing snakes. Back in the kitchen, Dilsey could hear that hoe hitting the flinty gravel. By sunset, exhausted in body and spirit, Granny limped back to the cabin. She left her supper untasted, and she changed into her church dress and said, "Dilsey, come on, honey. Let's hit the trail for preaching tonight. It's the last night of the revival." Reverend Thomas was in perfect form that night. The sermon was just a variation on the never-failing theme, the terrors of Judgment Day. "Where are you going to be, sinner? Where are you aiming to hide yourself that day when the mountains are a-burning, and the sea is a-boiling, and the sun is a-darkening, and the moon's a-bleeding, and the stars are a-falling? Folks," he went on, "I sat today at the bedside of a murderer. He took the life of a man who had done no wrong to him. For 5 years, he's been enduring torment. He's been shut up in a black pit way underneath a mountain, digging in the dark like a mole. And now the cold hand of death is laying upon him, choking the breath out of him until he can no longer raise his head off a pillar. He's about to go down a more darker pit than any coal mine, and there ain't nary a streak of light. The listeners in the audience grew tense. The shuffling of boots on the floor ceased. A creaking church pew became still. But listen, people, there's way worse things than killing a man's body. There's such a thing of standing in the way of a dying man making his peace with a great judge, and that's murdering a man's soul and sending him straight to hell. There was a sudden stir, and the sound of hard heels hitting the floor, heading for the back door, caused everybody to crane their necks to see who was leaving. The preacher paused. "Sister Tollett, I'd be right proud if you stayed." But Granny kept on walking. "I'm going home," slamming the church door behind her. Up the rough trail to the cabin, Granny Tollett walked fast and resolutely. She took off her bonnet to catch in her face the night breeze that was coming down from the mountain gap. Not once in the stiff climb did she stop to catch her breath. Once she reached her gate, she walked right past her house, and she unlatched the door of the lean-to shed. Within a moment, she emerged with a great sledgehammer that her husband had used long ago at his forge. She crossed the road and the creek, and she clambered over the pasture fence, and she trudged across the grassy meadow. Finally, she arrived, and she planted her feet at the head of her son's grave. She began hammering the face of the chiseled stone. Her slight frame staggered under the weight of each blow of the sledgehammer. Her breath panted stronger, and she sobbed with every blow. A dozen more clanging blows, and the whole stone was crisscrossed with cracks. Suddenly, it fell to pieces, splintered into 1,000 shapeless chips. Her panting sobs turned into a cry. "Oh, Tommy boy, you understand, don't you? I'm going to put you up one of those pretty store-bought stones of remembrance here, like your baby girl has been begging me to." She was completely wore out, and she collapsed beside her son's grave. And that night, John Cutshaw died.